Welcome to the Libertarian Institute Odyssey and YouTube channel. Today I am joined by the foreign policy analyst and writer at the Libertarian Institute, Connor Freeman. Connor, how's it going, brother?
I'm great, Keith. How are you?
I am doing very well, dude. Your article that we're gonna go over today, you absolutely hit it out of the park. I've gotten so much good feedback from it. Thank you for taking the time. And also, I have the news editor, Kyle Anzalone. Kyle, what's happening?
Not too much, Keith. How you doing, buddy?
Doing very well. I want to start off with Connor Freeman here. We have this article. We want you to keep the war going. Connor, what is your general thesis and main points in this article?
So the real impetus for this one is, you can tell by the third paragraph that I essentially got the idea after reading Kyle and Will have been pumping out just absolutely essential news articles, 5, 6, 7 a day, like 50 a month, it seems. And one of the ones that they ran about, I want to say 2 weeks ago, at the time I wrote it, it was a week had passed, but they had written one about a quote that Kyle had found, I believe, in the Washington Post, about how they were saying that some NATO member states prefer to see Ukrainians continue fighting and dying, that they prefer that to a peace that comes too early. These are quotes. A peace that comes too early or at too high a cost to Kiev and the rest of Europe. And I thought it would be worthwhile to do a translation of that. So I said, what they're really saying is that some in NATO are not necessarily concerned with a peace that comes at too high a cost to Kiev, but rather an outcome that comes at too low a cost to Moscow and Russia. Because it's becoming more and more obvious as time goes on that the real goal here is to essentially isolate and destroy Russia once and for all. There was just a report in the Washington Post recently. It's funny, with this piece, it only came out yesterday, and I feel like it's already out of date because, unfortunately, the military, Biden just announced that he's preparing another $800 million weapons military aid package for Ukraine, which would push the total amount at this point since the war began of military aid to well over, I believe, probably close to $3.5 billion at this point. And that includes, I would say, you have to remember that this is before the war started. They had already, since Donald Trump had sent Kiev roughly $3 billion, $2.7 billion in military aid. And then, of course, with the massive omnibus bill announced last month, I believe, you had $3.5 trillion pledged to replenish weapons stocks because they're running out with all the Stingers and the Javelins. And now there's a lot more, especially drones are being sent over there, and armored personnel carriers and sea drones and mines and things like this. And now especially the howitzers are a big, they're being highlighted quite a bit. There's this big push to send Kiev heavy artillery. And so the point of this article is to say that, it's just obvious at this point that the real benefit is we're seeing now we have the highest, it was already last year, they were already spending more on the military than we have ever in history, especially when you look at, as Robert Higgs will tell you, to go and take a look at the military budget, and then essentially you can double it and to get a real idea of the yearly national security budget. When you talk about, the nuclear weapons at the Department of Energy, Veterans Affairs, the interest on the national debt, the whole national security state with the intelligence community and all of this. And so, Biden just proposed for 2023, it's an $813 billion budget. And we're looking at how, they have essentially used this war, which they continue to say will go on for years and years. In fact, Mark Milley said that to the House Armed Services Committee it might have been earlier this month, actually. But he was saying, I don't see it, I'm not going to say a decade, but for years, absolutely, this war is going to go on for years. And the term we keep seeing from Jake Sullivan and Antony Blinken and these often unnamed, State Department officials in the media is that it's going to be a protracted war. And we've heard from Biden and his numerous gaffes where he may have been telling the truth. I mean, it appears that way, often where he's talking about the real goal here is regime change in Moscow. But beyond that, we're seeing that they actually do intend to essentially decouple from Russia, because the thing that's coming out now is that in the Washington Post, they're saying that the plan is long term is to isolate and weaken Russia, and that Europe is going to cut off all energy imports by 2030. They're now drafting a plan to ban Russian oil. They already drafted a plan to ban Russian coal. I mean, actually, that's supposed to essentially be finished in, I believe, 4 months. So I apologize. There's a lot going on here, so I know I'm a little all over the place. But so with all these new programs that have been announced, we brought back Lend-Lease, the World War II program to arm the Soviets and the French and the British during World War II. That has been brought back. Now the Congress is voting for all kinds of legislation that makes war with Russia inevitable, considering all the additional escalations we're seeing with NATO building up on Russia's borders, preparing to repel an invasion, and all this forming battle groups on Ukraine and NATO, new battle groups on Ukraine and Russia's borders. And now, if you look at that Lend-Lease legislation, it sounds like they're deliberately precluding a negotiated settlement, because they say that the war began when Russia annexed Crimea, and that and then the other thing is that they want to see Russia's military presence around Ukraine to go back to where it was, I think they say, on March 1st, 2021. But if they're talking about ceding Crimea, the Russians handing Crimea over to Kiev, that's never going to happen. So we could see this go on, conceivably. I think that's already the idea is for it to go on indefinitely. And then I point out, especially at the end, that we've heard from Zbigniew Brzezinski, Hillary Clinton, and people like this, that the strategy is to bleed Russia long term in a proxy war. And as it's been directly compared to Operation Cyclone in Afghanistan, which killed 1 million people. But the idea is that they brought down the Soviet Union, or that was a major factor in the fall of the USSR. And so that's all that matters to these hawks. They want to see, they don't care how many people die. As they say in the Washington Post, they prefer to see the Ukrainians fighting and dying. That means nothing to them. So all these crocodile tears are just PR for the rubes, as Eric Margulies would say. So this is a very dangerous situation. And we now have seen, actually, and I would have put this in there had I already seen it. I mean, the reports had come out before I wrote this, that it is now being reported that there are actually British SAS soldiers in Ukraine training the Ukrainians on these next generation light anti-tank weapons, which is arguably the most severe escalation we've seen so far. And I also go through how Slovakia is planning to send in fighter jets that they want to have replace the MiG-29s that we've been hearing so much about the last couple of months. They have a plan to send those to Ukraine and have them replaced with F-16s that they've ordered. We already know that Slovakia transferred S-300 air defense systems to Ukraine, and that Russia says that they destroyed an S-300 system. Slovakia disputes that it was theirs, but with the timeline, it's likely that was actually the case. And we see more things, like where Lithuania is saying that they're going to be training Ukrainian troops on their territory. And it's really getting out of hand, and the American people are not insisting that we hit the brakes. And so I thought it was important to show here that the plan is to make us, as they said when they had this meeting at the Pentagon the other week with the heads of the top 8, the CEOs of the top 8 defense military contractors, that they're planning for a war that will last years.
Unbelievable stuff. See, whenever it's the U.S. going into a war, we have to do it, and it's for our defense, so it's really good. And war does stimulate the economy, so it's really good. However, when it's the Russians, well, we're going to bleed those idiots dry. Don't they know that war misallocates resources to less desirable ends, and they're going to be using the strongest guys they have that could be building buildings? They're going to be getting shot at. So war is both vitally necessary and implies economic growth, and absolutely terrible and evil and destroys economies. even in the same country, a war in Afghanistan, they have this same. It's not even like they try and trick us with different countries at different times. It's like they have these blatant double standards, both morally and economically. So, excellent work you have done there. I now want to go to a article that Kyle has authored. It says, U.S. official, we are always preparing for the next weapons package for Ukraine. Kyle Anzalone, news editor at the Libertarian Institute. What is your general thesis on this one?
Yeah, so this is Matt Miller, who is on the National Security Council at the White House, speaking with MSNBC. And during that interview, they asked him if the White House was working on another arms package, and he answered affirmatively, saying, "The question about another arms package is really the easiest one you could ask me. The answer is yes, of course. We are always preparing the next package of security assistance to get into Ukraine." And, the reason that this is significant, Keith, is because the cost is mounting already with the next military aid package planned by the Biden administration. Just since February 24th, there'll be over $3 billion of weapons sent into Ukraine. And of course, I have another article out at the Institute today about how they have no ability to track these weapon shipments. And so not only are they sending billions of dollars of weapons into Ukraine and wasting our tax dollars, but they're sending these weapons and they have no ability to tell where they're going or anything like that. And as Connor was pointing out there, they're arming and training an insurgency in Ukraine. That's a part of what it is. Since 2015, the CIA ground branch, as this was reported by Zach Dorfman in Yahoo News, has been bringing Ukrainians to the United States and training them in insurgency tactics. And they thought, in the event of a Russian invasion, that these people would essentially be the leaders of the different insurgency cells against Moscow. And so they are planning for this war to last for a long time. High-level officials have said this. I quote Mark Milley from, I believe, the beginning of April, maybe April 4th. He said that while it may not go on decades, he believes this war will be measured in years. And then we have, as Connor pointed out, quotes from several U.S. officials saying that, essentially the plan is to arm and train an insurgency to bleed Russia. And recently, retired four-star Admiral James Stavridis, I believe is how you say his last name, said, and he was the former commander of NATO as well, said that we know how to arm and train an insurgency as a warning to Russia, and that Generals Mark Milley and Lloyd Austin had also conveyed this warning to Russia that they would face an insurgency in Ukraine. And so they're planning on this taking years. And, this is celebrated in the U.S. as some kind of great gift to the Ukrainians. But as Connor pointed out, look how this went for Afghanistan. Look how this went for Syria. That's the example I use in my article is, we now know that in 2011, the U.S., through Timber Sycamore, a CIA program, spent billions of dollars sending weapons into Syria. The most extremist groups got a hold of those weapons, and in the 2012, the DIA warned that this would lead to the rise of an Islamic caliphate, and that's exactly what happened. Millions of people lived under the rule of some of the most terrible governments in history because of what the U.S. did in Syria. I mean, they were cutting off hands for smoking cigarettes. They were executing kids for telling jokes, that were seen as degrading to Allah or something like that. The ways they were killing captured soldiers were absolutely cruel. Everybody was conscripted. And so now, there's not hundreds of thousands, probably tens of thousands of Syrians and Iraqis who were conscripted to fight for ISIS, who had now death sentences on them by their own governments, or who were tortured by the U.S.-backed militants as they took back territory from the Islamic State. I mean, all these horrible consequences, right? And we're pretending the narrative in the U.S. Everybody on Twitter, Matt Spoot, all these people, Jen Rubin, they have Ukrainian flags in their bios. They're screaming, "We are doing this for the Ukrainian people." But in reality, this is about them. It's about Washington. It's about their hubris, thinking that they could remake the world. In order to do so, Moscow has to be severely weakened to do that, and they are going to bleed Ukraine to make that happen. And as Connor said in that quote that I really covered from the Washington Post and really wanted to blow up, and that article did get a good bit of attention that I wrote for the Institute. They're openly saying now, Keith, that they want this war to go on, that the war dragging on would be good, and that is preferable for some NATO member states. Dave DeCamp, who's the news editor at antiwar.com, and at this point, me and Will Porter, the news team at the Institute, are working with Eric and Garris, Dave DeCamp, and Jason Ditz with antiwar.com to cover a lot more ground on foreign policy. But one of the things that Dave DeCamp has recently pointed out is the Russian ambassador is trying to get meetings with U.S. officials, and they're stonewalling him. Now, apparently, Russia isn't looking at having discussions with like top U.S. generals like Austin and Milley. So there is some of this going both ways. But the U.S. could be engaging in diplomacy with Russia, but they're absolutely making sure that won't happen. A lot of the laws currently being passed in the Congress that sanction Russia and that develop a hostile policy towards Russia, prevent trade with Russia, are based upon Russia actually giving up the Crimean Peninsula, which is held since 2014, and Russia has invested billions of dollars of infrastructure there. A popular referendum in Crimea approved with like 80 or 90% of the people voting in favor to join the Russian Federation over being a part of the Ukrainian government. And it's because, while Moscow and while Putin are, he's a ruler who, uses the authority of the state to control dissent. I think now tens of thousands of the anti-war protesters have been rounded up and giving jail sentences. That's horrific. At the same time, after the U.S. helped to orchestrate a coup in Ukraine in 2014, the incoming government put restrictions on the Russian language to the point that a rom-com starred in by the current president of Ukraine, Zelensky. So, right? Like, this is not a pro-Russian figure, Zelensky. His movie, Love in the Big City 2, was actually banned because it violated the Russian language laws in Ukraine at the time, which were trying to restrict the Russian language. And so, it goes that deep. But, more seriously, the government was waging what it called a terror campaign in the Donbass, which more like the U.S. war on terror was just a war against people who resisted the Kiev dictates and things like that. And so that an open civil war broke out, and now there's a war going on in Ukraine that's been far increased and exacerbated by Vladimir Putin and his invasion. A lot more terrible things are happening. But at the same time, this long-term war is going back to what the U.S. did and has been doing in Ukraine, with not only offering NATO membership, but particularly the 2014 coup. And this is just a terrible situation now.
Now, do you think the number 14,000 is accurate when it comes to the Donbass war going back to March of 2014?
I think that's like kind of on the lower end. A lot of people were using 15,000. I saw like around 2019, and there was some pretty intense fighting going on within the past year in the Donbass. And so that may be an undercount. And I do believe that is the number from the UN monitors and things like that, which do a pretty decent job. I think in the Donbass, there are quite a few monitors, and they've been there for years under the Minsk protocol agreements. However, at the same time, people die and they don't get counted for various reasons. So you always could guess that would be an undercount. And it's worth mentioning, too, that the majority of those deaths were in the Donbass region, the separatist region backed by Russia, not the Ukraine region. It's not like a situation here where the Ukrainians are just doing everything they can to stop provocations by the separatists in the Donbass region who are shelling civilian population centers or something like that. It's mainly going the other way. I think that the Donbass, regions have looked at one point they wanted to just join Russia as they were. It's actually two separate republics, Donetsk and Luhansk, but both in the past have floated the idea of joining Russia, not as the historic Donbass that Russia is now trying to take, but as the states that they were, as the people who were mainly Russian speaking, ethnically Russian people who preferred to join Moscow given the situation in Ukraine, or, to be independent, given the situation in Ukraine being so hostile towards, people of, who spoke Russian, of the Russian descent and everything like that. And so it's not surprising that this happened, but the Ukrainians pushing this war for the past 8 years, I think, is a big part of what ultimately provoked Russia to end up invading, along with, the U.S. treating Ukraine like a NATO ally, especially under the Biden administration.
Connor, can you walk us through what happened between the Yanukovych regime, why there was this coup, and how that led to this current conflict that we have?
Yeah. So essentially, the U.S., the European Union, backed by the U.S., tried to force Ukraine to make a decision to choose a economic and association agreement that was exclusive with the West, with the European Union, which it's important to note that the terms of that agreement basically subordinated Ukraine's national security interest to the larger, what they call, the European security architecture, which is a nice way of saying NATO. And that's one of the reasons why that's one of the reasons why even when they announced at the Bucharest summit in 2008 that they were going to be bringing Georgia and Ukraine into NATO, even though the Bush government was basically alone, when they made that announcement. And it was, heavily protested by, and has been ever since, by Paris and Berlin. But that's one of the reasons why, we've heard quotes from the famous "Niet means Niet" cable that William Burns, he's now the CIA director, but at the time he was the ambassador to Russia under George W. Bush. He told Condoleezza Rice that, for all intents and purposes, any Russian leader, conservative or liberal, and the whole political establishment there in Moscow, as I think he says, from the most backward, like knuckle draggers in the Kremlin, to the sharpest liberal, opponents of Putin, they all, none of them see Ukrainian membership in NATO as anything other than an existential threat to Russia's national security. So when they when Yanukovych made concessions and called for early elections and tried to maintain some sense of stability in the country, which was very divided over this issue. In fact, that's one of the things that Lavrov warned Burns about 6 years earlier, when he said, "Look, because of the ethnic divisions here, if you attempt to bring Kiev into NATO, it's likely to start a civil war." We just talked about there, in fact, was a civil war, and he said that that would force Russia to make the decision of whether or not to intervene. And he was saying to Burns, basically, like, don't make us have to make that decision. That wouldn't work out for anybody. And that and Burns said, this is the brightest of all red lines for Russia. But of course, Victoria Nuland, Robert Kagan's wife, went ahead and led the coup with Joe Biden leading it from the White House, and she was working with Jeffrey Pyatt, the ambassador to Ukraine, and Sullivan, who was Biden's national security advisor. All this is on the famous FDEU phone call, and of course, the whole. They wanted to get rid of Yanukovych. I mean, that's what she's saying. That's why she's saying FDEU, because they weren't on board for that just yet. And they said, we're going to midwife this thing, and we're going to use the vice president to do it. So they did that, and they used a bunch of neo-Nazis like the Azov Battalion, who were so instrumental in this coup and in the street violence and in the putsch, that they were then later incorporated into the National Guard. Now, the ethnic. Now, in the Donbass, at least before Putin's invasion in February, when he announced his special. Well, let me start with the Monday of that week, because I think it's notable that, for one, he said that he had recognized the independence of the Donetsk and Luhansk republics, which he had refrained from doing since 2014. As Kyle was saying, they voted in a referendum to join Russia, and Putin had said no. And that was one of the reasons why many analysts believed that Putin wasn't going to invade, because, for one, he stands to lose quite a bit in terms of the economic isolation, sanctions that were sure to come, and we've seen it's been unprecedented, but you kind of knew that was going to happen, that the American hawks and their allies in Europe would use any excuse to pull something like this. And he would lose the ability to influence Ukrainian politics by having, the people in the Donbass being able to, have a say in the government and this sort of thing. So if he annexed that region, he would lose that influence. Now, the other thing too is, as long as there was this kind of conflict that was ongoing, although I believe Moscow supported, the Minsk II agreement, which was, the idea was to give these republics some autonomy and to hold elections, but they would remain a part of Ukraine. They wouldn't join Russia, but this was undermined by Ukraine and the U.S. Since 2015. So now, when he announced that he was recognizing their independence, he was canceling the Minsk II agreement. But as I said, it's arguable that it was already dead. So when he announced that he was invading the country to defend these republics, we have to remember that the Donbass included, at that time, at least before Putin's invasion, hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens. So, this was beyond everything else, and the concerns of, the West, including Germany, invading Russia through Ukraine in the past, that this was a major national security issue, and that, as Kyle was alluding to earlier, referencing, I think it's the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, who documented that 81% of the civilian casualties between 2018 and 2021 took place in the territory held by these Donbass republics. And so, and as you said, probably more than 14,000 people were killed. So this was a long brewing conflict. But Putin announced that he was recognizing the independence, and that he ordered troops in there, and this was approved by the upper and lower house of the Russian parliament subsequently. Now, he didn't actually send troops there until the actual invasion and the bombing started. But in the interim there, the sanctions campaign, the massive sanctions campaign, basically already got kicked off. I mean, they really sanctioned the Russian parliament. They cut off Nord Stream 2. This was before the invasion. I still see in some people's writing where they go, well, after they cut Nord Stream, but that actually happened a day before. And I remember thinking when I was reading that, like, they're just giving this guy they're backing him into a corner, not to justify anything that Putin has done, but as Scott has talked about before, that Nord Stream 2, for all the Texas oil interests that Ted Cruz is out there with his jihad against Nord Stream 2 before all this, that was actually a very important thing to maintain economic interdependence between Russia and Europe, Russia and Germany, and more broadly Russia and Europe, was very important, especially when you consider that the Americans were encircling Russia and threatening its national security, especially all through Biden's first year in office. So one of the problems with as a backdrop to all this escalation with Ukraine is they held the largest NATO exercises since the Cold War on Russia's borders through over the course of many months, beginning in March last year. And around the same time, as Sheldon Richman mentioned in his recent piece for the Institute, his latest TGIF. I think it's Shades of Gray in Ukraine or something like that. He talks about how, in March of last year, Zelensky announced that he ordered a decree to retake Crimea, and there was all this talk of the Crimean platform, and he had support from allies in the Baltics and the Turks, and they were all talking about how we're gonna assist Kiev, and they're gonna take back their territorial integrity and their national and their sovereignty, and referring specifically to the Crimea and to the Donbass. And with the Crimea, the point I made in this most recent piece, of course, is that Russia is never giving up Crimea. That it's been the home of their Black Sea naval fleet and their only year-round warm water port for hundreds of years, since before the U.S. Constitution was ratified. And there's a whole history of the Soviets handing over the Crimea to Kiev. Back, Khrushchev did this in the early 60s in the 50s when he was taking power after Stalin died. This was more of a political move than anything else. It was, of course, it was always under control. All these parties were answerable to the Kremlin first, so it was really just a nice gesture, and he was shoring up support, for the transition. But after the end of the Cold War, they maintained this base on lease and did not, seize control of the territory, which they did without bloodshed until it was threatened in the wake of this coup that the U.S. Did in Kiev in 2014. So this, to answer your question, the real problem here, of course, is that this is part of a larger neoconservative strategy, as Kyle was referring to earlier. This is about strangling the multipolar world in its crib, right? So Charles Kruthammer at the end of the Cold War said in Foreign Affairs that this is America's unipolar moment, basically to make the world in our image and keep it that way. And this was really codified in the defense planning guidance that Wolfowitz and Zalmay Khalilzad under Dick Cheney and Bush 1's Defense Department drew up in 1992, where they say that we need to be the dominant military power in the world and ensure that we have enough military power and might that no conceivable challenger or alliance of challengers, Russia, China, Japan, Germany, could ever possibly think to even attempt to challenge us. So so that's basically the idea. But again, America blew its whole Cold War wad in the war on terror, and all of last year, Biden has essentially taken Obama and Trump's new Cold War policies against China and Russia and escalated them, and it's been on autopilot this entire time. Biden's military policy with respect to China has dwarfed Trump in terms of how many aircraft carriers he sent to the South China Sea, aircraft carrier strike groups, how many sorties of warplanes and spy planes are flying around in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, the Yellow Sea. You look at something like AUKUS, for instance, which totally undermines the non-proliferation regime in the region and transfers nuclear submarine technology to Australia, which is a part of this burgeoning NATO-style anti-China alliance called the Quad with India, Japan, and the U.S. and Australia. But with Russia, of course, now the whole idea was like, they were saying in Stars and Stripes that, because of COVID, we were only able to spend 82 days in the Black Sea with our warships last year. So we need to really make up for that this year. So they, I always say, I think they jumped the shark. They, in addition to these massive exercises, the main umbrella exercise was called Defender Europe 21, but there was also the massive Sea Breeze exercise, which took place in the Black Sea with well over 30 nations. I think it was like, I want to say 37 nations involved in this, training for war with Russia right in the Black Sea. Imagine if Russia and China and Iran and North Korea and Venezuela and Cuba did a similar drill in the Gulf of Mexico. I'm sure the American people would go, well, they're a defensive alliance, and you have to understand that this is a team building exercise or something. So this is basically I would argue that with the escalating sanctions and the fact that it wasn't just now that they're cutting off diplomacy. Of course, this was a trend that had started under Obama, but they continued to expel diplomats, and we now know. I believe his name is Derek Chollet, who's a counselor to Antony Blinken, who just revealed, I think last week on the War of the Rocks podcast, that they refused to negotiate with Russia in any serious way whatsoever. He said it was not on the table. This idea of talking about, Ukraine's the open door policy, as Lloyd Austin, the Raytheon board member, calls it, that the door is open. And that, we're not going to close it because we have all these principles while we're committing genocide in Yemen and support apartheid in Palestine. We really believe in national sovereignty and human rights and democracy and all this garbage. But Putin had made clear that this was his main issue. I mean, beyond everything else, beyond even the we're getting back into the INF treaty and things like this. Now, the way Chollet describes it is he goes, well, we didn't take that seriously. That's not a genuine interest. I forget how exactly what his quote was, but basically they just completely dismissed it, like it's a non-issue. I think he said, which is completely, anybody who was paying attention to what was going on knew that was not the case. And I'll admit that I actually believe that some of this, the other issues were more important to him, about rolling back the NATO military presence, which is a violation of the NATO-Russia founding agreement that Clinton, that came out under the Clinton administration, and of course all the promises, to Gorbachev that we would not expand NATO 1 inch to the east if Germany reunified under the alliance, and all this. I thought that and the arms control measures and the transparency measures that were going to be taken with regards to these ABM sites in Poland and Romania, I thought that was a big deal. But Kyle was saying the whole time, no, I think it's in addition to that, really look at this whole thing about Ukraine's membership in NATO. And that obviously was the case. And there's quotes from Putin where he's saying they're not taking it seriously. And this is very dangerous, what's going on right now. That was essentially what it was all about. This is about, you see it with China too. They continue to threaten to decouple from China at the same time that, the Republicans will tell you that you're, a weak liberal, drop your preferred expletive there to signify, that someone's effeminate or whatever. They say if you're not hawkish on China, or if you don't support decoupling or whatever. But meanwhile, that's why, because I differ with the policy of Kirk Campbell and Lloyd Austin and Antony Blinken and Barack Obama and Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton on China. So, we're in this very awkward position where there is this, they really have it locked down. The American people are, as much as they talk about ending the endless wars, that talk got shut down pretty quick once they turned this whole thing around on how, well, we're just going to pick fights with Russia and China at the same time, and you're all going to shut up and support us. And I think by and large, we've gone along with that. But this is about crushing Russia once and for all, and ensuring that this sort of multipolar world under international law doesn't happen, and that it stays what they call the international rules-based order, which is a nice way of saying the American empire and this pseudo-unipolar moment that they're clinging to after they basically destroyed the U.S. economy and killed millions of people over the last 20, 30 years.
Well, certainly. They had staged 2 fake Russiagate scandals against Putin, one in 2016 with 17 intelligence agencies confirmed Russian interference on behalf of Donald Trump. And then they had this 2.0 Russiagate where they said the Hunter Biden laptops are Russian disinformation. 50 intelligence officers have confirmed. So that certainly gives us every indication that this is an anti-Russian concept that we're dealing with. And of course, what you said about if you look at the numbers that Yanukovych got, this is a gentleman much more sympathetic to, or a politician rather, much more sympathetic uh, to Russia than someone like Zelensky is today. Well, if you look at these stats here, this is from David Stockman's article on antiwar.com. Yanukovych had heavy support in the Donbass region. He wins this vote democratically, and then there's a coup. Well, what do you think? They're just going to randomly accept the results of a coup when you didn't accept the results of an election? And of course, whenever something happens overseas, anyone who just wants to give in is Neville Chamberlain and an evil coward. Also, whenever the cops tell you to do something, you have to obey them or they have the right to kill you. I mean, it really is. It would be clown world if it wasn't so evil. Final thing that I'd like to go over, Kyle Anzalone and Will Porter. You gentlemen did an article, Israel police injure Palestinian protester, and journalists on Temple Mount. What is going on in Israel?
Yeah. So over the past couple of months now, tensions have been escalating across Israel and particularly the West Bank as Palestinians have carried out a series of attacks either on Israeli citizens and at times killing multiple citizens, as well as Israeli security forces. And Israeli security forces have responded by carrying out raids in the West Bank, particularly in a couple refugee camps, and killing quite a few people during those raids. And with that backdrop, after Friday prayers, Israeli police forces began to gather and prepare for a raid outside of the Temple Mount, which holds the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is one of the more holy sites in the Muslim, whole culture and faith. It also was supposed to, I guess historically, as the site of one of the temples of David. And so, there's a desire from some in Israel, of course, to like erect a new temple, but others, would I guess like it to be in a different situation. But I believe the King of Jordan actually controls what happens on the Temple Mount, or is supposed to. But anyways, the Palestinians believe that there was going to be an Israeli raid, and they start to set up wooden barricades, and then some kids threw some firecrackers, and at that point the Israelis carried out their raid. They broke some stained glass windows in a prayer hall to be able to fire in stun grenades, sound grenades, and rubber coated steel bullets, or sponge bullets. While they call these less than lethal weapons, they can be lethal, particularly the rubber coated steel bullets. But all of these things are typically misused. They're supposed to be shot at the ground and only hit lower extremities. But we had one of the guards at the Temple Mount actually shot in the eye by one of these sponge bullets, which you shouldn't place. Now, Haaretz did a good job breaking down two journalists who were beaten by the Israeli security forces. One video you could see, it's a female journalist just standing there recording in a fairly sizable protest. Police officer comes up behind her and hits her in the arm, and it broke her arm. And then the second one is a younger man who's a photojournalist, and he was hit by several Palestinian police officers and eventually falls to the ground. But there's other videos of other people being hit. Maureen Claire Murphy of the Electronic Intifada compiles a pretty good list of videos if you want to see some of the abuses going on by the Israeli security forces. There's also a video on the Temple Mount of some Palestinian father walking around with his son, and the Israeli police just come and start beating the guy. And that's the picture I used for the cover, because you can see this dad's just trying to defend his son, and this cop is just brutalizing him for no reason. And so that's this in the past has led to increased tensions. And last May, actually a pretty serious Israel bombing campaign of Gaza, and then Hamas firing some rockets back at Israel that killed scores of civilians in Gaza. A few people in Israel as well, but mostly in Gaza suffered, casualties, and of course, loss of infrastructure and everything like that, as Israel is dropping, 500-pound bombs versus the small Palestinian rockets. And the Israeli president has called on, the citizens of Israel to start carrying guns, and there's also marches in the streets of people chanting "Death to Arabs." And then the Israeli prime minister, not president, Naftali Bennett, said that he would like his security forces to do what they need to do to. They have free reign to take out the protesters or do what they need to do. So, this is likely to only continue the tensions in Israel. And I'm going to try to continue to cover this because I do think it could get worse. The political situation in Israel is very strained. The president Bennett lost the majority of his ruling coalition, and so in Israel you need to maintain your ruling coalition, and right now it's at exactly half, 60 votes. And so one of the ways that he could win over new people to his coalition, or at least people to vote for his legislation, everything like that, is to adopt a more aggressive position against the Palestinians. And that's traditionally what's happened in Israel. And so I think we're going to see more of that, and likely more violence in Israel, particularly directed at the Palestinians to come, but also keep the possibility that the apartheid state in Israel is going to lead to more Palestinian violence targeting Israelis. And, this is particularly terrible when it targets just people, like some of these attacks have been just, regular citizens. At least the security forces, when they're targeted, they are people actively engaged in enforcing the apartheid rules, but absolutely condemnable to attack civilians. And I'm afraid we're going to see more of that as a result of all of this as well.
And the devastating aspect of this is that there is conscription in Israel. So it's not like, well, if you're shooting at the military, that's a bunch of people who chose, out of all the jobs to have, to enforce these horrible restrictions. It's like these victims are fighting other victims, just as there's conscription in Russia. I know that there was a heavy conscription campaign, according to USA Today, in Ukraine. I think all men 18 to 60 were not allowed to leave Ukraine. I believe I saw a great deal of evidence that there's also conscription in Russia. But look at just how horrible this is. It's governments one-upping each other and using soldiers as pawns in this psychopathic game that that they're playing. But the bottom line is, just as with everything else, when they tell us, we can't really have a free market because there might be monopolies, and if you have a monopoly, you'll get lower quality and higher prices than you otherwise would. Well, what do you think giving the police a monopoly on law enforcement does, or getting the military the right to collect funds coercively and have the monopoly right to enforce this legislation that the state has? So if you want to really help us get to the heart of these issues that we're seeing, please consider checking out the donation page at the Libertarian Institute. You donate $25, you can pick up a digital copy of any one of our books. $50, you can get one of the hard copies of the books. You can also get Libertarian Institute mugs, tons of stuff. We also have a blog if you like getting a gist of what's going on. We have an archive regarding Oklahoma City, Will Grigg. We have podcasts if you like listening to Scott Horton, Kyle Anzalone, and Will Porter, myself, Patrick McFarland, and Tommy Salmons. Also a large collection of articles from the great Sheldon Richman and Scott Horton. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time, and thanks to everyone watching the Libertarian Institute Odyssey and YouTube channel. Take care, fellas.
Thanks, Keith. Thank you, everybody.